Lebanon's government resigning today. The prime minister saying that he and all of his ministers will back down and stand with the Lebanese people. Protesters there have been demanding political reform since a blast last week killed nearly 160 people. They blame the government for that explosion and for just years of corruption and economic ruin. NBC News chief foreign correspondent Richard Engel joins us now. Richard, what does it mean exactly for the entire government to resign? Who is in charge and what happens now?
Well, frankly, for the Lebanese people, this is one of the things that they are fighting against, because it sounds like a big change, but nothing actually changes. The same government remains in place. It is now just a caretaker government. The thing that will change eventually, and when it is unclear, and how profound the change will be is also unclear, is that this caretaker government will manage affairs until a new government is formed. That means a lot of backroom dealings, a lot of agreements, a lot of power sharing, power brokering. This happened in Lebanon last October, and it took months, and all you ended up with was a reshuffling of the deck with a new set of familiar cards laid out on the table. And now many Lebanese people feel that because of this crisis, the deck will simply be reshuffled again, and they'll get a very similar hand, which they think is the wrong hand that has been guiding Lebanon for the last 30 years. That is deeply corrupt and has led to a state where not only is there no power, the country's currency has collapsed, the economy has collapsed. Now tons and tons of ammonium nitrate are left unguarded, uncared for at the port until there is a fire after 6 years sitting there, and a large portion of the city is destroyed, and some 6,000 people were injured. And today, many Lebanese were posting online and writing about and speaking out for the individuals who lost their lives, that each one of these lives counts, and they blame the government for negligence and corruption. So, will much change? Not a lot of people in Lebanon are convinced that this will really bring the kind of systemic change that they want.
Richard, I know that people there, the protesters there want change, but are there some smaller, even specific things, specific demands that they have that they hope to see at some point?
They want Lebanon to be more like a normal country that works. And they look at their country, and it is profoundly broken. The currency collapsed up to 90% in value. So because the banks were effectively running a Ponzi scheme. And once the Ponzi scheme evaporated, like all Ponzi schemes, the whole thing disintegrated. So people lost their savings. The power, which always cut, I lived in Lebanon for years, it always cut frequently. Now it cuts for the majority of the day, and recently it's cut almost all the time. Now, a huge blast that has damaged the city. People don't have money in their bank accounts to pay it. They don't have confidence that things will change. They can't even afford to pay the generators that help supplement all of the power that is cutting. People say it is worse now and more demoralizing than even during the days of the Civil War. And that was a very, very dark time during the 1980s for the Lebanese, with massive sectarian fighting and violence and kidnapping. They say now it is perhaps even more demoralizing.
Really tough times there in Lebanon. Richard, thank you for explaining to us what's going on there this week.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here, and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.